The church is not a building, nor is it even the people. What I'm reading comes from this. The church is not a building. No, it is not even the people. It is actually the living presence of a holy God in a fallen world. It is the tangible evidence of an invisible hope, dressed in the skin of all the people who have found that hope. And when society comes unglued, as we've seen it do lately, the church becomes God's lighthouse, shining the way for our ships to avoid the rocks, survive the tempest, and come into a safe harbor. If there was ever a day when we needed the church, this is it. If there was ever a greater opportunity to invite our faithless friends, we have it now. There's a legend about a church in southern Europe called the House of Many Lamps. It was built in the 16th century and had no provision for artificial light except for a receptacle at every seat for the placement of a lamp. In the evenings, as the people came to church, they would carry their own light with them. When they entered the church building, they would place their lamp in the receptacle as they began to worship. If someone stayed away, his place remained dark. If more than a few stayed away, the darkness seemed to spread. It took the regular presence of every member to illuminate that sanctuary. When you forsake assembling, when that little light of yours is not allowed to shine, you leave a spot of darkness. If enough people heed your example to take Sundays off, a great darkness begins to fall across the house of many lamps. It's discouraging to walk into a half-empty house of God. And there are a great many today that have more empty seats than full ones. In Europe, the darkness has nearly engulfed a continent that once dominated Christendom. A continent that gave us Luther, Calvin, Wycliffe, John Wesley, Spurgeon, and so many others. The absence of your light also produces a sense of cold emptiness. Also, I just want to back up someone when I mentioned Luther, as most people would know Martin Luther. On a cold and blustery winter evening, a husband and wife made themselves as comfortable as they could before the crackling fireplace as they awaited the arrival of their pastor. He had made the appointment earlier in the day. The husband steeled himself against the anticipated rebuke. They had previously been in a habit of attending every service every week, but over the past year they rarely made it once a month. In quotation, we're just as good as some people. They rarely made it once a month. I mean, well, my bad. I'm sorry. Well, let me say that again. In quotation, we're just as good as some people who go to church twice every Sunday. And I'm going to make it clear to our pastor too, the husband blustered. The doorbell rang and the pastor entered. Remaining in his overcoat, he silently walked directly to the fireplace, took up the tongs, lifted a brightly glowing coal from out of the fire, placed it on the hearth, and, still silent, stepped back to watch. The husband eventually joined him in an oddly silent observation. After a very long time, the once red-hot glow turned into a cold, dark mass. Finally, the pastor wordlessly turned to the man and gave him a look that spoke volumes. The man got the message. Like that coal, we burn brightly when we are together, but we burn out when we stand alone. Now, if you ever saw any coal, it shows a great light when it's all together, but it's just set one coal fire, and by itself, not so bright. As for me, here I stand, squarely on on the side of God's church. As a young man, I gave my heart to Christ and my hands to the church. I've had wonderful days there, as well as a few painful ones. If Christ comes tomorrow, a wonderful thought, I want him to find me faithfully serving the fellowship of the saints, the gathering of the holy priesthood. So that's why God's people, should be in church. As always, church is not mandatory, but it's always highly recommended for God's people to be in God's house every Sunday. And so remember that the church is not, that's why it says, the church is not the building, and it's not even the people. It's the actual living presence of a holy God in a fallen world. So make no excuses. Be in church every Sunday, and if your church has a Sunday evening service, or if there's, if you know of any churches around your town that has a Sunday evening service, go. And I remember years ago, I heard or read or maybe both something like the question is, in these last days, how often should God's people be in church? Whenever it's open. So do more than just go to church on Sunday mornings and also Sunday evenings, but whenever it's open, and don't forget Wednesday night too.